Thank you so much to all of you for being here or staying with us for this second talk. I'm very pleased to welcome now Professor Dr. Grass from the ETH, Mathilde Rosier coming all the way from Burgundy today for this talk, and Mareike Dittmer, who will moderate the talk. I renew my thanks to Luma Foundation for hosting these talks here today in their very nice Schwarzes Café. Hope you will enjoy it. And yeah, I pass on the word to Mareike. Mareike is associate publisher of FRIEZE, the art magazine FRIEZE. Thank you, Mareike. Thank you to all of you for being here today.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to hosting the second talk in this series this afternoon, where artists are meeting scientists. After the first one, where we had kind of like a very similar attitudes and expressions about how people work, I think with this one we might get a little bit more, not confrontational, but possibly figuring out a couple of difficulties and dissimilarities between the ways of working and perceiving the world and thinking. I'm very glad to having Professor Robert Grass here, who works at this functional material laboratory at the ETH, which I find is a really interesting title because it sounds so straightforward. You think you know what this means, but when you start actually trying, I was like, okay, what do I say what they are doing there? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to say anything. Actually, I'm going to leave that to you to give us a little glimpse into the world that you are doing. Mathilde Rosier is an artist I've been knowing for, I guess, about 15 years or something. And what is nice to see in the way her work evolved from when we first met, you were mainly working with film.
Yeah.
And
music.
And film and music, and this kind of like, over the years, this became much more influenced by performance, and this performance that was dealing with painting, but painting just as a kind of like prop in the beginning, has now evolved into a properly painterly attitude in your work, where performance still plays a big role, but the paintings have kind of developed from props to objects, which we're going to see. And when I was approached for this talk, I was immediately thinking of you because I'd just seen the latest work, which you all can still see, and the Castello de Rivoli is at the moment a group show curated by Chus Martinez. And Mathilde has a whole series of big-scale paintings in that, and it's just prolonged till September. So if your way leads you to Italy, to Turin, then please don't miss that. Mathilde, I would suggest you start showing us a little bit from your practice to kind of like get these ideas, what you're working on. And
yeah, Robert?
With what do you want to start?
With the one with the black and white. People.
Abstracting attraction. This one?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Can you make it louder?
Who am I am the abyss. The bottom of my soul has so much depth. Neither joy nor the waves of sorrow can reach it. I am bliss. Who am I? I am the abyss. The bottom of my soul has so much depth. neither joy nor the waves of sorrow can reach it. I am bliss. Who am I? I am the abyss, the bottom of my soul.
Yeah, I'm going to show you another film, also based on a dance performance, and then
First start.
yes. Yeah. Allô, allô. Yeah. Yeah. Midsummer night, lovers in disguise say, release me from my own company. Disguised, I am deprived of identity. Dispossessed, comme union. Dispossessed, comme union. Impersonal umpire out of the alphabet. Alphabet swept by the dance script. Swept, dispossessed, comme union. Possessed, dispossessed, reset. All words said, full in a hole, forgotten, they stay happy like worms. Only in the
I can probably make it a little larger.
Ouais.
Try.
Eh,
Oh, sorry. Come back. Yes.
yeah. So this is a show that just ended at my gallery in Milan, Raffaella Cortese, and I was showing this film that you just saw, and this series of very big paintings. They are 2 meter 30 high. They have exactly the dimension of doors. And can you zoom in?
That's
No?
all. Don't think so.
So we can put another one so we can see some. Well, yeah, good. Yeah, and in the museum in Torino, it's also the same. Other paintings like that, of this kind of character that for me are a bit undescribable. And I think the common point of what I've always been trying to do since we know each other, since actually the beginning of my work, is that I've been trying to make works that leave people speechless. So that's why it's difficult to talk about it, of course, but I love to talk about speechlessness. I think it's a very interesting fight to have in this world today, and especially in the art world, because it's a lot about speech and converting visual impression into language. And I'm not completely opposed to it, and I'm interested in reading about art also and thinking about art, but my way to do it and to appreciate the most is when actually an artwork leaves me speechless, or anything in life leave me speechless. So yeah, I think that's a common point of all those works. And the concept of speechlessness and going out of the alphabet, in the sense that alphabet is a vehicle for thought and concept, which is very useful, and I'm very grateful that I have this capacity to use my brain in this configuration. But I think there's also another level of belonging to the world, which does not imply the alphabet and the language and the conceptual thinking, which is a completely unmediated relation to the world through senses and intuition. So often people ask me why I refer to the shell, and since also it's a motif that comes again and again since I started to work. It's probably because I see that those slugs, those little animals, have really a very interesting life to me, because they're completely contemplative. Probably their brain is very silent, if you can call that a brain, but their existence seems to me quite ideal, very modest, living in the ocean and just eating a few vegetables. And if they are not eaten, which is of course not the best way to end a life, but beside that, it's a good life. Voilà.
And just one question, and when you say that you want to get away from this world of alphabet and this kind of like dominating force that language makes us always to be aware, to judge things, to consider things, to put them into kind of like sort them into boxes and say this is this and this is that, and if it's black it cannot be white. Do you just want to kind of like get away from this alphabet via a more sensual or even spiritual way of looking at the world, or you would like to replace it by a more flexible alphabet maybe that is not as rigid? Do you see this kind of like visualization? What you are? I mean, it still speaks. I feel
this is a language, of course.
It is a language. So
it's a language, but it's not the. And I started, funnily enough, I started to use language myself because I started in the last year to make those songs and to sing and to use words, what I was not doing before. So. I think it doesn't matter. We can even use language to go out. We can use the alphabet to go out of the alphabet. Mm-hmm. That's what the best poets do, probably. Mm-hmm. They explode language, they explode the alphabet, and they leave you in a space of pure liveliness and vitality, which is not really anymore an experience in the mind.
Mm-hmm. I would suggest Robert gives us now a little glimpse into as you said so nicely when we were kind of like talking before, what do we do all day in the laboratory? And I was like, yes, I'd like to know. So
Yes, excellent. So I work at ETH Zurich. I'm a chemist, and I work there in the Functional Materials Laboratory, which is a team. We are kind of a team of people, kind of pictures here. We are 2 professors, Wendelin Stark and myself, and we lead these teams in doing our work. With mostly doctoral students who also do some education in the terms. And what we try to do is to find technical solutions to problems. That's our main goal that we do. We have to, of course, decide what problems and how we want to solve those. And we come from a material and chemical aspect, so we want to solve problems which can be solved by making new materials, by making new processes for materials, or by using existing materials in new ways, in ways they've not been used before. And usually we do this by some chemical tricks, because that's our, let's say, competitive advantage, is that we know chemistry. Many people don't know so much chemistry, and so that's our advantage of some chemical tricks we know to solve problems. So a big part of our work is identifying pairs of problems and solutions. And that may sound easy at the beginning, but often we start with a solution and we look for a problem to the solution, because we have some, let's say, chemicals or some things we see that are fascinating, and we then try to find out, well, where would those be useful? Or the other way around, we interact with scientific literature to get ideas or to get problems. But we also interact a lot with the remainder of the world, or we try to interact. We interact with industry to get to their problems. We get to media. We are influenced by media to get to problems that the world has we are not aware of in our everyday life. Or we get to problems by discussions with our colleagues or doctors we talk to, or even our friends, just everyday problems where we see that's something that we would like to solve. And those are ideas which are not different than anybody else could have. I think the difference that we have is that we can test if that solution that we hypothetically came up with, if that solves the problem. So we can, let's say, test that. And usually that doesn't work. And so we have to go back and we kind of do that process in circles. And the big difference to industry is that we don't have a financial constraint to this. We can do that in a much more open way, this iteration. And in the first step, it certainly doesn't have to be financially feasible. And to do, let's say, this loop, this iteration, we have what we call a chemical playground, which is kind of a lab. It's more than a kitchen. You can do things there you can't do at home, you can't do in a garage. They might be dangerous, they involve chemicals which are regulated. And we kind of play with those in a way to solve the problems we have identified. And I just want to show some pictures of the lab, actually. That's Michele, he's more on the electrical side, interfacing chemistry with electricity, with analytics. We work with extremely small volumes in microliters. We also work towards industry in multi-liter reactor volumes in which we do our chemical reactions. We build our own reactors. So this is a reactor we built to make nanoparticles. So often to solve the problem, sometimes it's going to the lab and quickly trying something. But very often that involves, well, first we have to build a machine to show that we can solve that problem. This is an example of such a machine. We have a machine lab which helps us making machines specific for our needs, so we can make our own machines really by mechanical craftsmanship. And then we also have very advanced analytical tools where we can detect DNA, for example, as here, or we have an electron microscope with which we can do analysis in a very small nanometer scale, where usually we don't have access to that in our everyday life. So we have special tools to try to go through the cycle, and if after usually a few iterations in that cycle, we essentially find a solution that works, we write a scientific publication and generate public knowledge. But at the same time, we always also try to generate value out of it, so generate patent, IP, and ideally a spin-off company. And to make this less, let's say, theoretical, some few examples. So this is more from my colleague Wendelin Stark. In traditional engineering, you have machines which are steel, like a motor. And so what you have on the right there is an artificial heart, which is also built like a machine, hard. But really machines in our body, they're soft. So all of our muscles are soft. So we developed a soft machine that's an artificial heart. And if the movie works, I'll just give you, it's nice to see, I think. So you see it works, but obviously in this it's not a product yet, or it only works for half an hour. So we're still in that loop. We still have to improve it or work on it or advance it so that it really solves the problem of being a real soft artificial heart and being able to replace that mechanical machine that we had before. Another thing is filtration. So this is a nanoporous filter we developed in our lab, which has extremely small pores in a polymer, which colleagues from mine took and made that a filter membrane with which they said, well, that we can filter water. Bacteria and viruses, they won't flow through the pores, but water will flow through. So they went and took this and made a device out of it and made a commercial filter that you screw a bottle on it and you press on the bottle, the muck stays in the membrane and clean water comes out. And actually you can buy that in Transa just across the street. So that's something that really made it from the lab, from this initial science to a product. Or another idea is we try to generate barcodes in products. So we take very minuscule small labels. Actually, we take DNA, in which we can put some information and put that into a product with the idea to generate what we tell a paternity test for products. So we take a barcode, we put into a product. As the barcode is DNA, the product kind of gets a DNA that's specific for it. And then we can use, as you do in paternity testing, we can use DNA testing to say who made that product. And that's kind of the initial idea, but that also went on. And two of my former students, they founded the company Helixer. And together with Gubelin, that's now implemented into a product which marks emeralds. So they put DNA into emerald so that the emerald keeps its identity where it came from throughout the whole life of the stone. So that's kind of translating this original, perhaps crazy idea of in the lab to a product. And we have many other similar ideas. If you're interested, you can certainly come and visit our lab. We could arrange for that, and because we like showing what we do and talk about our work.
Super. Mathilde, what do you think about the idea of storing memory codes in DNA that is then transplanted into objects?
Yeah, I found it very poetic.
So I have to add, we also store information in DNA. So a part of the work that we do is that we put like books and we store it in DNA to make it storable for long times. That at the moment doesn't have a real, I would say, application today because it's still very expensive. But I think it's interesting from a way of translating really, let's say, alphabet. I mean, we really take words and we translate them to something biological.
Which is again coded in another alphabet.
Yes, exactly.
That's a crazy thing.
Yeah. I'll just put that back up.
Yeah,
yes.
But I read that it's amazing what we could potentially store like the whole knowledge possible in a drop.
Yes, exactly. So that's because DNA has such a high density of storage. So I don't know in a drop, but in a few grams of DNA you can store, I don't know, exabytes of, so unimaginable amounts of information, because the tool that biology developed to store genetic information is extremely powerful. In every cell of our body we have a few gigabytes of information. Of course, in biology you don't look at it like that way. You look at it as a gene and as a functional. But if you look at it from an engineering view,
Yeah.
it's information,
information.
biological information. And
How do you read the information out of the DNA again?
yeah, so there's sequencing technology, which was developed over, let's say, the last 20 or 30 years. Was developed mainly for medical diagnostics, so medical use to improve our health. And what we kind of do, we steal this technology, which was developed for medical use, for different use, and let's say misuse it from where it originally was developed for. Because it has matured so fast and got so cheap, because we're interested in analyzing our genome, that we can now start using it for other things which sounded unimaginable a few years ago.
What I find interesting is the way what you describe in your work. You seem to oscillate between different modi of working, in a sense. And maybe that is because it's a university and it's not a kind of like completely commodified, like a company where you have to work under certain money, whatever restrictions.
Yeah.
Because what I was first saying, that we might discover a lot of not similarities. In a way, I see quite a few moments when you treat things like a playground, and you say, like sometimes what you said in the beginning, you create solutions for problems that haven't been identified yet. So you might have to identify the problem after you found something that seems fascinating as a
or we have to look for
solution.
somebody who has the problem. I think our process is more that we have an intuition that what we have is useful, and then we have to find out where does it fit into the world.
But this I find out, I think there is a connection to when we were talking a lot about how you use intuition for your art, but then of course it's not that you just tell other people then, oh, this is the artwork and my intuition just tells me this is a good artwork, go with it. No, you perceive a piece of art, and then comes the kind of like putting it into context and all this that comes often later. Don't you think?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, of course. We are, but the best scientists are super intuitive people. I'm sure you have this. You really feel you generate from the unknown. You download ideas that don't.
I think that's not true. We use our experience we build. And so what we do, we change topics or fields quite a lot. So we look at different things, and we kind of carry the experience from our previous work we did into the new work. And then we generate a benefit for that, to that field, to that problem. And once that benefit has been applied, we like to move on, because that has been applied, and then that's extinguished somehow, and then you have to go on to a new problem with which you again take your knowledge you have from your previous experience and apply it there. So I think this intuition, it only comes by experience from previous things that you've worked on. Education, of course, to some extent, but.
and is there a way that you kind of like develop in your laboratory, because it's a collective working there, what you
Yes,
said,
exactly.
which is a difference to an artist working in their individual praxis, even so you are also collaborating, you have collaborated with other artists, but specifically your way of working is individual. Is there a collective kind of, a specific kind of like an inspiration you get from the collective working?
I don't think from the collective per se, but many, let's say, additional ideas come in and are discussed, and there's a lot of, let's say, that can also be stop an idea because somebody else is a stupid idea. The more I work in this, the more I see especially in a collective, the value of a vision, of an idea, of a vision, because anybody can have an idea, an extremely smart idea, but mostly ideas are not followed, or there's not enough energy behind an idea to follow it through. And so in a collective, I see that usually somebody in that collective grasps the idea and makes it his idea, and then fights for the idea, and fights to put it into practice or put it into reality in this. And what we try to do is to be able to give somebody else a glimpse of an idea or potential of an idea, and see how he makes it his own idea. I think that's something really fascinating on this kind of vision of an idea and to put energy in an idea and then push it forward.
It's like a ball. It's like a game.
Yes,
with a
exactly.
ball, and
Yeah.
the idea is the ball.
The idea is a ball, and you try to pass it on to your team or to the other people who are there, and develop tools or ways on how you can best make them that they take the ball and run with it towards the goal. Kind of. That's to put it in a
But
picture.
do you take also your inspiration from the outside world?
Yes, we try to do that as much as possible in any way to go outside of our, let's say, small world we have in the lab. We try to get experiments to be done outside of the lab, so that we do field experiments, which in chemistry is not so common, so that we really test the things we do not in our own small world, but in kind of a realer world. And the spin-off companies are also something that enable that, because with that technology developed in a lab that works once usually, it can then be replicated and translated into real usage.
But I was thinking also, just coming here, I realized it's amazing that I'm invited to this talk here in Zurich, because it's actually exactly 1 century ago that in Zurich there were also the Café Voltaire, was this place for Dada experimentation, and at the same time there were, if I'm not wrong, there were Einstein was also here, and he was coming up with this theory of relativity, right?
Lenin was here.
Yeah.
Bakunin was here, the anarchist. It's kind of like...
Yeah, but those people were not really meeting, no? But there was something in the air that was enough for some kind of strange coincidences between, because the theory of relativity put the notion of what is real completely upside down. Yeah. And what the Dada were doing was also a total revolution in terms of what is art, what is reality, but those people, we meet, but they didn't meet, know.
And perhaps they did, I don't know, who knows, yeah.
But that's very nice that we have this, nowadays we have this contact. And also in the university where I teach in Basel, we have a lot
of scientists visiting.
We invite, I teach art, of course, and we have a lot of scientists visiting and talking about what they do. But I think it's good that now those two milieux are more porous. But even if they are not, I think that, before having to know your work, I never heard about this, what you're doing. And when I found your video, I was like, wow, that's amazing. But it felt like I knew a bit about it before, without knowing.
We had the intuition. Yeah. But I think this is truly something that developed over the past 15 years, maybe more. Like, I think it's only 3 years that the CERN has visiting artists now that come once a year and can develop work based on the experience of working with and it's kind of course it also came much more into the art world with this video. I mean, what kind of like how would you collaborate with a scientist as an artist when you're in your kind of like studio and paint your painting? There is kind of like, you can still talk with scientists about pigments, and there's quite a few things, but it lends itself much more to the newer technologies that are used in art as well. How is it for you? Is this was this invitation for this kind of talk the first encounter, or is the
certainly in this world, I let's say come from a family that has an interest in art, but let's say really exposed in this way, that's the first time, I would say. And I think it's really interesting to, as you said, I think what's really interesting in your idea of this alphabet, I think two things. One is you like this really simplicity, so the silence kind of, but on the other side, they're really extreme to it. This, let's say, more than let's say those things that are too complicated that can be, let's say, translated by language. And so I see those two extremes in that. And is there any connection in that, or how does that work?
Yeah, there's a silence that is called stupidity.
Yeah.
And there's another silence which is after knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sad news. you have to go through you have to go through all the knowledge to get to the silence, which is a form of wisdom, actually. And unfortunately, those two forms of silence are not the same. The silence before the alphabet and the silence after the alphabet are not.
But still, you have this
equivalent
fascination for
the human.
For the shells.
Yeah.
So I mean, they have, as you said, kind of a stupid silence, probably.
We don't know.
We don't know.
Actually, I don't think so, because I live in the countryside, and I spend a lot of time just observing what's happening outside. Yeah. And I observe the life of insects. The intelligence of those animals is amazing. Of course, it's not, probably it's not the intelligence of every individual, but there's this kind of collective intelligence that they get in touch with, and they are extremely intelligent. Probably more than us, because they just obey to this collective intelligence, and it seems that each minute, each second, they know perfectly what they have to do, so they just follow this.
And also they know it without having learned it. I mean, that would be one of the my question to you as a scientist. If you have learned to inscribe information into DNA, could that possibly lead to this? There is this theory that you cannot inherit memory, but some animals seem to have a certain knowledge that can only be transferred by DNA or whatever.
Yes, for me it's difficult. I'm not an expert in, let's say, in inheritance. We know nowadays that memory can be inherited, so by modification of DNA, not by the genome itself, but let's say some modifications of it, chemical modifications of it, that can be inherited. So there have been experiments analysis of people who've been to war. That, let's say, the trauma that has an effect on the next generation. But I'm really not an expert. So if I
but I was wondering, is that a similar
not? Yeah,
but is that a similar process? Do you think that trauma is a kind of like chemical inscription on the DNA? What happens in your body? Possibly
one of the current views, yes, that there's a chemical inscription. In the DNA, chemical
this
modification.
Would be similar to what you are using to store information on
This
DNA.
is kind of similar. We actually use the genomic way to store information. You can then play it on and do chemical modification to simulate that what we have in biology, to advance it in that way. But usually we are purpose driven, and then we stick to the, let's say, easiest, which is the, let's say, genomic way of storing information in DNA. And we, in our work there, that's completely free of any biology. We really use it as a tool. We don't think actually about its implications it has back to the meaning DNA has as such.
This would have been my next question. The kind of like, in a way, artists, but also scientists, there is a kind of like certain point where ethic becomes a big subject, which you should consider in all your work. In a way, because of course a lot of things are possible to do, but do you question the moments where you say like, oh, we could do that, but actually, do we want to do that?
Yeah, I think there's always an ethical element in everything we do. There's then, of course, the ethical element where you need an ethics commission, there's animal experiments, like that. But I think in terms of ethics, things we do, experiments we do, we always have to, they have some ethical aspect. We use tax money. Is it a good idea? Is it ethical in a way to use that money for that experiment? Is it useful in some way? And so this aspect of usefulness or potential risk, something you do has, over the potential reward it has, is something that constantly goes into the work. It's difficult to judge that, and we are not the only ones who can judge that, because, for example, in our barcoding we do, where we put this DNA into products, the question is there potential harm of doing that? And is the harm of doing that greater or smaller as the potential benefit that I can say where my food comes from, for example, if it comes from a good source or from a bad source? So those are questions which constantly come into the work. which are important to after the, let's say, technical solution, I would say, in what you do with it or what you can do with it. Purely in showing what's technical possible. As the financial part, we kind of ignore, we, let's say, put it under the blanket for a moment, show what's possible, and then start the discussion, and with that advantage, see what can be done with it, and where its limits are also.
It reminded me of Michel Serres. You know Michel Serres? No? Well, he's a French, now he's a philosopher, but he's quite old, he's in his 80s, but he started his career as a mathematician, I think, or scientist, anyway. And he quit sciences because he realized that during the course of the 20th century, ethics and science just completely split. And that was probably after the atomic bombs on Japan, and he was a young man back then. So he moved back to philosophy because that was more harmless.
Yeah.
And but it's also strange because I realized that in art we are more and more. I have the feeling we are more and more concerned about ethics. Or maybe it's because I start teaching and I realize I'm always this question of ethic in the work of my students. I'm very, and in the work we do and also because the students ask for that. They are very conscious about that, and they want us to be ethic.
Yeah, and I think ethic is also cultural connection somehow. So how the thing you do, the art or the development you do, fits into a cultural context somehow, because ethical probably has some very strong cultural heritage. If we, let's say,
of course, eating people is wrong.
Exactly,
is in a cannibalistic tribe not necessarily the cultural circumstances
that we have, and so I think that's really interesting. Let's say if outside of the ethical part, I find really interesting in the art world how it has to fit into, or how much it fits into a cultural aspect. Or in your work, if you, let's say, if that's important for you, and if you define that, or if that's kind of, it just happens that way, or how does that work?
That's a question?
Yeah.
No, I'm super concerned about that.
Yeah.
As a person first, and in my work.
Yeah.
It's, I don't think you can make an artwork today that is not aware of what's happening and contribute in some way. And even if it's not really straightforward, I see my work as being political and engaged.
This is, I think it's more the question of being engaged and political, not in the sense political correct, or not in the sense of kind of like necessarily forcefully having one course that is kind of like printed in fat letters on top of the work.
No.
That doesn't need to be, but the thinking behind this is what I meant, is like you might start playfully without searching for a solution for something, but once you arrive at that, what is the work, then it gets contextualized, and by this it gets the cultural also kind of like a place in the world.
And it's very true in this sense. It's true. Now I get it. Yeah. And in fact, yes, I come up with a solution and I see how we can apply. It's quite true. Yeah.
And then, do you think about what you expect from your, let's say, viewers or people who come to your art? What you expect from them that they know about your art, or about yourself, or about the background the art was developed in? Do you make it as the art for itself, and it should really work by itself, or what do you expect? Because, let's say, I think without cultural background, you can't understand any piece of art. So the question is, what do you expect from your viewer?
A mix. I think there's a certain fatality. You cannot appreciate anything without a certain training. You know, it's. I don't think there's any straightforward, innocent pleasure and love without a certain education.
Yeah.
Even riding a bicycle, you need to even tasting a good beer. You know, you have to learn how to taste a good beer. and you have to learn that it's better to drink it cold than warm. You know? If you don't have education for that, you wouldn't see the difference.
Yeah.
So with contemporary art, it's the same. But there's a big problem with contemporary art because it's actually people think it's complicated, where very often it's actually much simpler than they think.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of contraction in front of contemporary art because it seems so. It's just an opportunity to let go and just be wild, you know, just with your.
I think there's also different levels of understanding, and I think that's probably similar to science. I mean, I could probably, after you put this nice invitation, come to your laboratory and start to understand a certain level of what you are doing. But without spending probably quite a bit of reading and looking into things, I will never get beyond that level. Still, I might have pleasure in coming to the laboratory and getting a few new things. I think this is with an art exhibition similar. You can just go and don't need to read the catalog or anything about. But then your understanding of what is happening there might be limited, or might be just on a certain level of either central pleasure or what.
For me, the question is then, I think every, let's say, artist or scientist decides on what level people, or how easy it is to understand the art. Sometimes, let's take music, it's easiest. Pop art, you have, let's say, 70% who say that I understand it. You would take 12-tone music, it has a very different access. You need a lot of more. And so in the work we do, we kind of actively decide we don't want to do something really specific that only my 5 colleagues understand, which might be really important, but it can only be grasped by very few people. We want something that has a larger impact that can be understood by more. And I think in the scientific, in the art world, it's very similar. And my question is that by design, or so how do you do that?
No, I think we just do what we can. Basically, I can just talk for myself, of course, but I just do what I can, and I see. I'm not really concerned about how many people see it or like it or understand it. It's not really my problem.
Yeah.
I shouldn't worry about that, you know, because we know when you learn a bit about art history that you understand well that that's not really the point.
Yeah.
The quantity of people who understand what you do is not really important.
Okay. And then the goal. So your inner goal is for yourself.
No.
But it is to connect with others.
It's to contribute. Instead of feeling to contribute, knowing that you are a drop in an ocean, but we have billions of drops, so it's fine.
Yeah.
I'm afraid time-wise, we need to interrupt this now, but as Charlotte said before, we all going to be latest from 5 at the terrace downstairs. So any questions to the 2 of them or the other speakers that are going to follow after us, please send. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
I'm glad that in the end there's more similarities than we thought in the beginning.
Probably, yes.
So,
Thanks so much.